Well, good morning.
Good morning.
And Happy New Year. Yeah? Oh, somebody clapped. Yes. I'm excited. This is our first week of the new year back in person. If you didn't realize it, that's why, right? Because you didn't show up the last 2 weeks normally because you're like, it's holidays. Okay. So we are so glad and excited to kick this year off and be back together as a church family. As Scott said last week, we got together all our campuses digitally together. But man, we're excited for what God holds for us in 2022 for our church and for our community. And as we kind of start this, we're sliding into the back half of the book of Romans as we kind of pick up our study that we paused a little bit over the holiday season. And we're really, really excited as we dive into this to see what God has for us. You know, as I was thinking about this, it kind of was like when I start a sermon, it just swirls in my head all week. And yesterday I woke up around 8 o'clock for like the 10th time of the day, right? Because children, fun. I've been like getting in this routine. I'll wake up a little bit earlier if my two oldest ones just won't decide they want to be up for the day. I'm like, okay, you go watch a movie. I'll set it up for you. You can watch Toy Story, and then we're going to go back to bed because the baby kept us up all night, right? But so they had it, and then finally I get up and I come out, and then my youngest Archie's like, I'm hungry. I'm like, okay, I'm Dad. Nice to meet you. I say that a lot. He doesn't think it's funny. But I was like, okay, fine. I was like, how about I make pancakes? And his eyes lit up. He got excited. Arya squealed. She went, oh. And she's like, yes. And this was a big moment for me because my son, he eats frozen pancakes almost every day. And those are like gross, right? Frozen pancakes you put in the microwave for like 30 seconds and kids love them. Adults, they're not so good. But I was like, and usually when I would make him pancakes from scratch, he'd say, no, I don't want them. I want my pancakes. I was like, your pancakes are not good. He's like, no, I don't like yours. They're disgusting. They're gross. And I'm like, how do you even know those words or like what they mean? Like, come on, dude. Finally, over the past month, I convinced him that my pancakes are better because I put chocolate chips in them and it's great. And so he's so excited. So I start making it, and I first get all the ingredients out, and then I start with the dry ingredients. I get some baking powder and some baking soda. You put flour with it, put a little bit of sugar in there, and start mixing that. Then you move on to the wet ingredients. It calls for buttermilk, which, does anyone have buttermilk just hanging around, right? So then you Google substitute for buttermilk. It's great. You can just use milk and vinegar. It's awesome. So I do that and then put the egg in, put some oil in, I whisk that, and then I combine the ingredients. And then you combine them really well, and then it says, let's sit for 20 or 30 minutes. The kids are going crazy. They're really, really hungry. They're getting more angry. I'm like, shh, it's going to be worth it. And then we wait, and then finally it's time. The skillet's ready. It's greased with oil, and I start pouring the pancakes. And this is when the magic starts to happen, right? This is when the work for me starts to happen. You got to make sure they bubble. Got to check the bottom. Oh, it's browning a little bit. And then start flipping and going. And then all of a sudden start handing out pancakes to happy kids, happy wife, happy life. Yeah. You see, as we dive back into the book of Romans, it's kind of like making pancakes. The first 9 chapters, Paul has given us all the ingredients of what this Christian life is like. He's saying it's all about your faith. It's all about Jesus. It's not about what you've done. It's not about how you've paved the road, but I'm giving you the essentials, the principles, the precepts of what this life of following Jesus is like. And he's given it us all. He's even mixed them together, and he says, here's your pot. But starting in chapter 10 is when we got to start that. And then we got to start pouring pancakes and do the work. And from chapter 10 on, we're going to get into the practical application of Romans, is how do we take this truth of the Bible? How do we take what we just reflected on in Christmas, that Jesus has changed the whole world, that he changed our lives, that he is the Son of God, and it was only by faith in him. And how does that then change us? Well, that brings us to our key thought today, which we're going to dive into and then kind of work from here, is Jesus didn't just change the world, but he wants to continually change you. You see, so often we get out of Christmas and we think about the busyness of the season, but then we reflect and we see that, yeah, it is all about Jesus. We're like, yeah, that's great about what happened 2,000 years ago. Yeah, that's great. That is what my faith is in. But then we go into the new year and we make resolutions. We make all these things, but nothing really changes in our life spiritually. And maybe we make resolutions of something we're bad at, and we say like, hey, I'm going to work out more. I'm going to read more. I'm going to do this more. And anyone still good on your resolutions, right? We're about a week and a half in, so most of them are probably canceled by now. I think the new thing now is you don't even call it resolutions. You just say, I have some goals, some aspirations, so then you don't feel like a failure when you don't live up to them in 2 weeks. They're like, they're still out there. I'm just like, haven't put them into practice yet. But so often, too often, we try to be someone new. We try to be something new, but nothing in our life changes. We may start a gym membership for a little bit and think that's going to be the answer, but then it falls back. And you see, the reason is because the only difference in the year is that we're writing a new year, but we're not actually doing anything different in our lives to set us up for accountability. You see, in order to change, we need something outside of ourselves to help push us. I was thinking about this as I have an aspiration this year is I need to start an exercise routine. Now, why that's an aspiration is because I feel like it needs to be far out there, like once my kid sleeps through the night a little bit again, because there's this thing called sleep regression at 4 months old as a baby that I didn't believe was a thing until it happened to us, and now it's terrible. But I was like, so out there, I have this fitness goal. But I'm like, as I'm thinking through this, I'm like, how am I going to make this work? Because if I get Scott, convince him to show up to my house 5 times a week and make me work out, I know it will be effective. It will be scary, but it would be effective. He said did you say you do that? Amen to that. I was using it as a hypothetical. I did not say I'm asking, okay? But there's, no, don't come tomorrow. No, okay. But like that will work, but so often we just take smaller steps than that. Well, like, I'm going to think about it more. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to buy a gym membership. And somehow, even though I haven't had the willpower to work out for the last 5 years, because I'm paying a gym membership, I'll go. But you don't. And when we look at our lives spiritually, we need to see that there needs to be something that pushes us. There needs to be true change needs to come from something outside of us and to change us not only spiritually, but emotionally, physically, socially. And in order for that to happen, it's not relying on our own strength, but it's relying on Jesus to do the work for us. In Romans chapter 6, in verse 4, Paul puts this beautifully when he talks about what this life in Jesus does. And we studied this about a month and a half ago or so, but it says this, it says, therefore we were buried with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, listen to this, so we too may walk in newness of life. It's because of what Jesus has done that we can walk in newness. It's because of what Jesus has done that we are changed. And Romans 1-9 tells us that Jesus offers us this amazing deal that our old life can literally be wiped away and we can have something new in him. But how do we know if it's working? How do we know if we are different? How do we know that we are actually on the right track, that we are moving the right direction? How do we know that our old life isn't just creeping back up and looks exactly the same? How can we recognize and ensure that Jesus is actually changing us? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to see as we dive into Romans chapter 10. If you have your Bible or your phone app, you can pull that up and see all our notes today. But we're going to see how do we notice a difference in our lives when we see how Jesus changes us? What are kind of the road markers, the light bulb that goes off in that? Over this holiday season, I got to watch quite a few movies. I watched Spider-Man, which was amazing. I took the kids to see Sing 2, which was also very good. I watched The Matrix, which was horrible. That was terrible. But I was thinking, and I love movies. And like when I was thinking about this, is sometimes you watch a movie and you have no idea what's going on, especially if that movie's by Christopher Nolan. And I remember a couple years ago, this movie Tenet came out, and I went and saw it with a buddy. And the whole movie, I'm like, I have no idea what's happening. Like, am I smart enough for this movie? Should I be in here? Like, they should have give us a test before we walked in, like, if we could follow this movie or not. And then one scene happened in that movie And it just like clicked. I'm like, oh, it all makes sense. And I remember turning to my friend, I'm like, dude, that's that thing from earlier. He's like, yeah, I figured that out 30 minutes ago. I'm like, oh, you didn't tell me. I was lost. But sometimes in our spiritual life, we just feel like we're going through and we're like, has the light bulb turned on? How do I know it's like all of a sudden when the light bulb turns and you see it, you're like, oh, that's how God's changing my life. But sometimes along the way, we don't see those signs. So today, as we kind of dive up Romans chapter 10, let's see how God is changing us. And it first shows by the change in our hearts. Starting and reading in verse 1 of Romans chapter 10, this is what Paul writes. He says this, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and my prayer to God concerning them, this is to the Israel people, to the Jews, is for their salvation. I can testify about them that they have zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Since they are ignorant of the righteousness of God and attempted to establish their own righteousness, they have not submitted to God's righteousness. Verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. You see, through the first 9 chapters of Romans, Paul has been the ultimate teacher, the ultimate theologian, the ultimate guy who argues and wins, almost like a lawyer. He has been like laying out the truth of the gospel. He has been showing it's like, it's not by what you do. It's not about this. This worldview is garbage. It's all about Jesus. And he's been like very, very succinctly dissecting other arguments and tearing them apart and then showing who Jesus is. But here in chapter 10, he begins to make this shift. And he begins to show his heart in this situation. Now, if you're not familiar with him or need a little refresher on who this man Paul is, his background, he was known by another name as Saul. And in that, he grew up in this Jewish Israel background, and he was what they called a Pharisee. And a Pharisee was this religious leader, but it was also like a political leader. It had power, and he was a powerful man rising through the ranks. And he was very accomplished. He was very respected in his regiment. And as Christianity started to blow up, he saw it as a threat, and he was one of the leaders in helping stop it, persecuting Christians, killing Christians, helping that movement squash and go down. And all of a sudden, he was blinded when he was on a road, and Jesus literally spoke to him and changed his life. But Paul was caught in this weird in-between because his old life, all the Pharisees hated him. His new life, they were like, dude, wasn't that the dude like 2 weeks ago that was trying to kill us? Like, he can't just change a letter of his name and then we'll take him in. Like, it doesn't work that way, right? Like, they was trying to kill us. And then all of a sudden, like, and having that in mind, then he becomes all of a sudden this creator, this planter of churches and this strategist and this missionary all across the known world. But 2 things that I think are important to keep in mind about his background when we read these verses is first that his background was a cold man of rules, of regulations, of black and white, of the dude who literally sat holding coats while people were pelted with rocks and died. He wasn't warm and fuzzy. He wasn't a guy who was just like, it wasn't like Mr. Rogers when he went up and talked to Paul. Like, he was a cold, harsh man. And then all of a sudden here, we see this man of concern and love, where he literally talks about my heart's desire. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But then the second thing is we also don't ever hear about Paul having a family. Some will suggest that he might have been married before he came to Christ because that was custom, but there is nothing in Scripture that suggests that. So his family, the people he loved, was God's Old Testament people of Israel. The ones he grew up with, the ones he knew. And he references this love in chapter 9, verse 2. He says that, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the benefit of my brothers and sisters, my own flesh and blood. You see, he said, I wish I could trade my salvation for those who don't believe. And just think for a second of how Jesus transformed this practical, cold heart of Paul to a guy who cared and loved for people so much. No longer was he a cold, rigid rule follower. Instead, he is literally yearning, and he is trying to have something for things that aren't even possible, like trying to trade his salvation with somebody else. And you see, what I think is so important as we read these first 4 verses is his love for those far from Jesus is so undeniable, is so changed. Of where he was to where God took him was night and day. And I think when we read these verses and we reflect on in this new year, it's like, is God changing us? Are we really a changed Christian? We need to first look at our hearts. Is our heart becoming softer? Is our heart becoming more loving for others? And listen, this is a hard thing to do. Just recently, my daughter, before shower time, she thought it was fun. They get like crazy during, like right before we had to like take showers and, read books and get to bed. It's like, it's fun to pretend to be a dog, right? And just like go around the house barking. Like this is not fun for me. I'm like, go get ready to take a shower. Go get ready to, and I asked her like 5 times, and just, and then chasing, and then getting the other one to start acting like a dog too, and he's still getting pajamas on, so he's half naked, so it's just like not working well. And I'm like, Aria. And then finally, the dog hits her chin on the ground and starts crying. And what did Daddy say? Oh, I'm so sorry. No, I said, this is why I told you to get ready for a shower. I said, this is why we don't do this. And my wife's like, she's crying. I'm like, yeah, but she needs to learn. And like, I'm all annoyed and angry. My wife's like, she's really hurt. I'm like, okay, I gotta take, and then it was worse because the next day she had a big old bruise on her chin. I'm like, why did you actually have to be hurt? If it was like your pretend hurt, I wouldn't feel so bad. It wasn't as much there, But in our situation, so often we look at our world the same way. As we point fingers and say, like, I told you not to do that. I told you that lifestyle would end up like that. I told you doing that. I told you not to buy that. I told you not to date that girl. I told you not to talk to that person, because if you did that, it was going to end up, you're going to fall on your face, and I'm just going to point at you and say, I told you so. And Paul could have easily told the Jews, I told you so. And he could have been like, I'm going to stand in heaven. I'm going to look down to hell one time and say, I told you so. But instead he said, my heart yearns for them. And when we look at ourselves in this new year, are we letting Jesus change our hearts? And you know how it does that? Is he says that he says his desire and his prayer to God. He said, I didn't change my heart and become a nicer person on my own, because I have a feeling Paul naturally was someone like me, very logical, not very compassionate. But it was praying for God to soften his heart, to see people for their salvation, to yearn, to love them. And what if we were more focused in this new year of praying for the love and mercy and grace and salvation of those who disagree with us or those who are away from us, rather than praying for God's justice to reign? And so often I think that we can get this backwards, but we see that our heart, when it changes, it's evidence that God is changing our lives, when it is softening, when it is love. But it's not only our heart, it's also our head. Let's keep reading in verse 5. He says, since Moses writes about the law, the righteousness that is from the law, he says this, the one who does these things will live by them. But, verse 6, the righteousness that comes from faith speaks like this. Do not say in your heart, who will go up to heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will go down into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. On the contrary, what does it say? He says, the message is near in you, in your mouth, and in your heart. Now, this is kind of like when we first read this, you're like, was Paul trying to say here? He's actually quoting Deuteronomy chapter 30. And I want to flip back and read that real quick in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 12, because I think it sheds some light on what he's trying to get across here. But this is how it reads, and he pretty much quotes this almost verbatim, but changes a few things. But it says, it is not in heaven, so that you have to ask who will go up to heaven, get it for us and proclaim it to us so that we may follow it. And it is not across the sea, so that you may have to ask who will cross the sea and get it for us and proclaim it to us so that we may follow it. Verse 14, but the message is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may follow it. You see, what Paul is trying to get across here is he's saying that the Jews here were falling into the trap of asking questions like, how am I going to accomplish this? How am I going to be a better person? How am I going to measure up to God's standard and God's law? How am I going to literally go up to heaven, right? How am I going to cross the sea? How am I going to accomplish this impossible task? But instead, Paul says, no. He says it's the one who lives by faith. They're not asking those questions of how do I accomplish this, because it's not about what we accomplish. Rather, it's about what God has accomplished. And this leads perfectly into, as you continue reading verse 8, he says, this is the message of faith that we proclaim. If you confess with your mouth, and this is where Paul starts to take what he read in the Old Testament and literally read Jesus into that passage. He says, if you confess with your mouth what? Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Here's the mindset change that we see in our lives, that when we know that Christ is transforming us, is that it's not looking at our lives, it's not getting stressed, it's not getting overwhelmed, it's not asking how can I accomplish all these millions of tasks that I think I need to do, that I put in my head, but instead it's looking at God knowing he's in control. This past week, I had a phone call with someone very close to me, and he called me and said, bro, I think I had a panic attack. I was like, all right. I was like, we're young. I was like, we shouldn't have panic attacks yet, but our whole world is freaking out, so that's understandable. I was like, what happened? I was like, what triggered it? He's like, dude, I don't know, work. Everyone I know has COVID, right? Everyone has COVID right now, but Arizona doesn't care. We're just all going on. So anyway, he's like, family, stress, finances, just everything. He's like, I don't know what happened. I'm just overwhelmed, and I'm freaking out and sweating, and it's crazy. And so often our world wires us to almost think that way, because it puts this pressure on us that if you don't do this, if you don't do that, if you don't check all these boxes, if you don't pick up your kid from school, that one you got to do. But if you don't follow all these things, if you don't accomplish all this, if you're not reading 10 books a day, if you're not doing this, blah, 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 whatever it is, fill in for your life, then you are failing. But Paul says no, time out. It's not about asking how you're going to earn your way up to heaven or how you're just going to run across the sea. It's saying that Jesus already went. He paid that price. He went to hell, he paid the price, and he raised again to heaven. We don't have to worry about how we're going to build a ladder up, because he's going to call us up one day. And Paul says, stop with the stress, stop with this mindset that it's all on me to do this, when literally it's all that Jesus has done. And he gives us additional encouragement. Starting in verse 10, he kind of expands on this. He says, one believes with the heart, resulting in righteousness, and one confesses with the mouth, resulting in salvation. For the scripture says, everyone who believes on him will not be put to shame, since there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, because the same Lord of all richly blesses all who call on him. Verse 13, listen to this, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Here's what is so cool about, I think, as we listen to this and how this is so practical in our lives in Romans, is when we read this and we are so overwhelmed with everything in our life, we can take a step back and say that the big thing that matters is that God is still in control. Amen. And the bigger thing that matters is that if you're on the Jesus side of it, that he's in control, and one day your salvation is secure and you're going to heaven. And no matter what meaningless task that may pop up that literally look like the most important thing in your life, it's not that important at the end of the day. And Paul kind of shifts our focus. He says, I know there's obstacles, I know there's sin in life, I know there's stress, and I know there's even things, I love this, that will shame you, and Satan will bring up your past and say, look, this is how I know you're a failure. And he's like, no one's put to shame, because if you confess with your mouth and call on the name of the Lord, you're saved, and he has you. And you see, this is what Jesus wants us to do. This is how he shows us that he is changing us, is our heart is truly transforming to truly love those around us. Our mind is seeing the bigger picture of salvation and God in control, instead of the small little things here on earth that stress us out. And lastly, the final kind of road mark that we see that changes is we see a change in our feet. Check out verse 14. He says, how then can they call on him who they have not believed in? And how can they believe without hearing about him? And how can they hear without a preacher? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Paul shows the natural next step of a changed heart and a changed head and a changed mind is for us to then walk into our world and tell other people about that change that has happened in our life. And he thinks about the imagery he gives here. He gives of feet. And feet here, he actually says, how beautiful are the feet that carry this message. Now, Transform, when he's writing this is 2,000 years ago. There wasn't like tennis shoes then. It was sandals, right? There also wasn't pavement then. It was dirt roads. Feet were probably not very nice looking. About a year and a half ago, I hiked the Grand Canyon, and I have like these toe socks, so like you don't really lose toenails, but like you'll feel it at the end. But after we were done, we decided to go to a pizza place, and I wore flip flops. That's what I wear most of the time when it's not cold outside. I was like, let my feet breathe, it'll be nice. And I made it through the whole canyon, didn't lose a toenail. And then as I'm at the pizza shop, one of the guys that went with us is wearing like boots. I'm like, bro, you just got out of hiking shoes. And my big toe hits the side of his boot as he like turns, and I just feel this searing pain go through my toe. I'm like, bro, that ain't good. I'm like, I think I feel the blood surging through my toenail right now. And then it hurt really bad. I'm like, oh, okay, that's not going to feel good tomorrow. Tomorrow I woke up and my toenail's black. It took a year for that stupid toenail to grow out. And it was like raised, and every time it would go a little bit farther, like you'd cut it off, and then there's like black stuff underneath that doesn't smell nice, and I don't know what is a conglomeration of blood and lint and everything else. Literally took a year for me to get a new toenail. So every time my wife looked at my toe, she's like, your toe looks disgusting, right? Like, it just was gross. And I have a feeling that in Rome 2,000 years ago, there was a lot of black toenails, right? Those feet were disgusting. They were gross looking. But Paul says it's not about the feet. It's not about how gross the feet look. But it's beautiful because of the message they bring. And here he gives this imagery that the feet themselves, yeah, they're ugly, but the message they brought, it was a total change. And this is kind of the final litmus test for us, is if Jesus is truly changing us, is do we want others to change as well? Are we going to people? Are we going and talking to those around us, in our family, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods, and are we telling them what is so important in our life? Because sometimes on Sunday morning, we're like, yeah, I'm all sold out. I love Jesus. Jesus is great. Jesus is my best friend. It's awesome. And then we leave here, and we never talk about Jesus until next Sunday. And trust me, even pastors fall into that trap. Because I'm like, I don't want to talk to anyone. I don't want to see anyone this week. I just want to fly by, and then I'll see people next week, right? But all in here, we need to kind of break this mold. And here's the problem, is what's hard to do here is somewhere along the line in our society, they've kind of embraced this idea of don't bother me with what your stuff is. Like, you believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe, and then we'll just have this coexisting relationship, and you don't talk to me about your Jesus. And somewhere along the line, the church has almost embraced that too. Like, oh, if I talk to him, we'll probably get in an argument. Oh, if I talk to them, it might offend their lifestyle, or I might offend them. Like, if you're a jerk, you'll offend them. But if you tell them about Jesus, it's not offensive. And we've almost embraced this, like, oh, I don't want conflict. I don't want awkwardness in the workplace. I don't want my neighbor to think I'm a weirdo. It's like, so I'll just, like, keep that tight to my chest. And Paul's like, no. The feet aren't beautiful when they stay at home. The feet are beautiful when they take the message outside of that. And here's the deal, is sometimes we're going to be discouraged because sometimes it will start an argument. Sometimes people will ignore you, maybe shun you, not listen to you. But this isn't a new story either. Look at verse 16 as he talks about this news is brought. But listen, he gives a caveat, but not all have obeyed the gospel. Not all have listened to it. And he keeps going. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the message about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Yes, they did. This is talking about Israel, the people who heard God's word over and over and over and over again, and even they said, no, God, I'm not going there. Keep going in second half, verse 18 says, their voice has gone out to the whole earth, but their words to the ends of the world. Verse 19, but I asked, did Israel not understand? First Moses said, I will make you jealous of those who you are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that lacks understanding. And Isaiah says boldly, I was found by those who were not looking for me. I revealed myself to those who were not asking for me. But verse 21, this is important here, but to Israel he says, all day long, I have held out my hands to a disobedient and to a defiant people. That imagery, I think, here is powerful because our job isn't to argue into someone's heart. Our job isn't to judge other people for their choices and for their lifestyle. It's simply to be the beautiful feet, bringing the good news, and then holding the arms open and saying the offer is there. You see, too often we fall into this trap of we either do nothing and we never talk about our faith, and we never talk about Jesus, or we do the opposite end and we want everything to be a fight. But Paul says the litmus test here is my heart changing? Is my mind changing? And then as a result of that naturally, am I then telling people why that is the case? How it's not something I've done on my own. How it's not all of a sudden that I woke up and all of a sudden I truly care for people. It's not that all of a sudden I woke up and now I'm not stressing about the world and I'm not concerned that our whole world is going to end by a virus or get burned down by politicians or whatever else it is. But I have faith in a God that it's Him who is transforming me and not myself. Here's how I want to wrap up today. And kind of to put this all in a bow today is I want to give a New Year challenge. And this is the New Year challenge that I want to kind of ask you to take a step forward with today. And I want you to kind of dwell on this statement. You can write it down. It's in our notes. I want you to, how can you apply this in your life? And it is this, that I will commit to making Jesus known to myself, to my family, and to my fields. I will commit to making Jesus known, truly knowing Him, truly letting Him change me, first to myself. And the litmus test, the questions to ask is my heart any different? Is my mind any different? And are my feet going somewhere they haven't gone before? And then from there is, now am I giving this to my family? Am I showing this to them? And then from there, am I going out to my job, to my neighborhood, to wherever else God is leading me to be able to share this news? And I want to wrap this up by reading these verses again in verse 14, because this is the reason the church exists right here, is how then can they call on Him they have not believed in? And how can they believe without hearing Him? And how can they hear without a preacher? And how can they preach unless they are sent? We talk about our mission statement all the time here at Cross Church is to make Jesus known. And let me tell you, you are sent out as a part of this church, as a part of this family, to tell people about this changed life you have in Jesus. That is the only thing that can make true change personally and at large in our worlds. Let's pray as we wrap up today.